Hello. In this episode, we're going to begin our study of the area of population and development, an important topic in development economics. It's a good idea to begin this study with looking at the big picture, both around the world and historically, to get a sense of where we are now and what the background to that has been. So it's instructive to think about the history of population over a long period of time. We begin here 10,000 years ago. 10,000 years ago, a pretty common estimate of the total number of people living in the world was about 5 million. I've seen different estimates. The highest I saw was about 10 million. And by the way, I've seen an estimate for 100,000 years ago as 250,000. So that we can see that in this period of time, there were small numbers of people, and the population growth rates, nonetheless, were also very small. So somewhere around 10,000 years ago, the agricultural revolution was giving rise to the first large towns or small cities. And from this point, there was a slight increase, but rather slight, nonetheless, in the annual rate of growth of population. Nonetheless, by the year 1 Common Era, we probably on the Earth had reached a population of about 175 million people. And so that in the preceding 1,000 years, there had been a population growth of 0.13 of a percent, a little more than 0.1% per year. It was not until around the start of the modern epoch that the population growth rates began to rise sometime after 1500, but in particular towards and around 1800, which not coincidentally was around the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. At this point, population growth began in more earnest, and in fact, by about 1800, or a little bit after 1800, the world population reached 1 billion people for the first time. And so subsequently, the growth rate of population increased itself and reached a maximum of a little over 2% per year just after 1970. And it continued high in the subsequent decade at 1.88%. But it has declined steadily since then, and currently around now, between 2018 and 2020, the expected population growth, when all the numbers are in, should be around 1.18%. Perhaps 1.14%, updated figures. And so we can see with these high rates of population growth that population has continued to grow very substantially, now in the 7.6 billion range, now expected to reach nearly 10 billion people at 2050 and over 11 billion people at the end of the century. So this really represents a dramatic and unprecedented rise when you think about the move from 5 million people to already over 5 billion people by 1990. That's a 1,000-fold increase. If you think about world population growth overall, since 1950, when many of today's developed countries, although having much lower incomes actually than today, nonetheless had reached developed country status, the number of people living in the more developed countries has grown, but not very fast, and it still hovers in the billion range, a little over 1 billion people. Much of the growth was found in the developing countries, many of the middle income, lower middle, and upper middle income countries, and some of the low income countries are considered here, but the least developed countries, 49 or so, many small but developing countries, are now representing the group of countries in the world with the very fastest population growth, which is going to affect their ability to begin to develop and get out of their low income status. Just briefly, in all of these recent trends, with the highest population growth being found in Africa, that's the most significant trend that's likely to be seen between the period of 2010 and 2050, in which the share of world population in Africa is expected to increase from around 15% and reach about 22%. And it will continue to grow as a share after that time. The rest of the world has had more comparatively minor changes, Asia and Pacific falling just 3 percentage points. You get a picture of the distribution of the population in the world in this graphic, which adjusts the land area to reflect the population who are living in those countries. There's actually software that you can download and try this for different kinds of characteristics that you are interested in. I rather like this approach, in which each square, which you can't see here, but each underlying square represents 1 million people. And so it's precise in that way, in a way that's more visible than with the graphic that I showed you. And so I think it's really worth getting a sense of what we learn from looking at this that perhaps we don't always expect if you've not stared at maps like this before. One looks here and thinks this green country might be Russia, but actually this is China. Russia is this yellow strip around it. The size of India is truly dramatic, and in fact, China is expected to be eclipsed by India as the largest country in population within the next few years. Also striking is the size of Bangladesh and the size of Pakistan. Bangladesh is dramatic because it's around the size of Wisconsin. I say around depending on how you count inland bodies of water and the like. Japan is large, Philippines is large, Indonesia is very large, and so we don't always think of it this way, but it has a lot of people, over 200 million, and it has a growing role and influence in the world. This, in contrast, is Australia. Another interesting fact, of course, it's striking how small Canada is in relation to the US when weighted by population. But these are the Caribbean islands. I don't think we always remember how populated they are. Indeed, if you count up the squares in the Caribbean, you find there's more people living there than there are in Canada. So we can really learn a lot from this that we don't already perhaps guess, or is perhaps not first and foremost in our minds. And you can look back on this and you'll see some other interesting observations, I think. Just on the subject of Africa, Africa is also quite big. Perhaps you've seen this map. It was going around social media a couple of years ago, but it gives a sense of the scale of Africa. This is China, United States, India, Mexico, and Western Europe. And why not also Japan? And so that with this, you really get a sense that it's a very large continent. Worth keeping that in mind. Now, what has happened with respect to births per woman, as we call it, fertility? So here we have the cases of the year 1990, which happens to be the baseline year for the original Millennium Development Goals, and 2017, fairly recent year. And so here countries are divided into 4 categories. One is where the fertility is high, and it's been declining fairly slowly, or relatively slowly, of which Niger is now the highest fertility country in the world. Well, they're not all here, but I think this is in the world. In 1990, it had 7.8 births per woman as an average. Today, it has fallen to 7.2. Some of these other countries began with over 7 births per woman and still have at least 5.6 births per woman. In some cases where fertility was quite high in 1990, at least 5.9 to 7.5, nonetheless it's been falling quite rapidly. You know, an example is Ethiopia, which began with a fertility of 7.2, similar to Angola, and Mali, it's fallen all the way to 4.1 births per woman. So that's really quite striking. Also, we have some countries that have reached close to replacement fertility, Bangladesh is included on this list, although actually its fertility has ticked up just a little bit recently, falling from 4.5 births per woman to an estimated 2.1. And then we have a number of countries, and we'll come back to this in a later episode, and I guess it will be a fifth episode for chapter 6. We have some set of countries, of which China is the famous example, that now have below replacement fertility. That is to say, they fell, despite the one-child policy that was still in effect in 1990, fell from 2.4 births per woman at that time to 1.6 births per woman today. And there are some other countries with this same below replacement fertility situation, and I'll also add some others to that list when we come back to this question of below replacement fertility in developing countries in the last episode related to chapter 6. So there's an enormous amount of diversity here, but there's really two main cases. A set of countries for which fertility remains high, that is to say, is consistent with continued rises in population and possibly dramatic even increases in population size. And then there are a few but growing number of countries which face a different issue, which will ultimately be declines in population. So that's the range and scope. 3 years ago, the United Nations released its new World Population Prospects Revision, which it does every few years, I think every 5 years. And so they now project world population to be at 8.6 billion by 2030. And nearly, as I said a moment ago, nearly 10 billion by 2050. And so it was once the case that successive reports showed smaller population projections than previous ones, as the scholars sort of were catching up with their models and analysis with the more rapidly than expected falls in births per woman. But now those changes have occurred, and such that there's been some slight increases now in projected population growth, quite striking. Nonetheless, population growth has slowed. Most population growth continues in the developing regions. I say give or take a billion. It's difficult to project populations, to say the very least, and so the UN always gives confidence intervals. And so within an 80% confidence, in 2050 the world population could be as few as 9.5 billion, as many as 10 billion. So that's a half a billion difference. In 2100 it could be between 10 billion and 12.4 billion with 80% confidence. So that is, I'm calling it give or take a billion. So it's important that these estimates are the best that can be done with today's knowledge. And so some of it is educated guesswork. India is going to be the world's most populous country very soon, possibly 2024. And at that point, each will be having about 1.4 billion people, something like a sixth of the world's population, or if you take the two countries together, a third of world population. Population of Nigeria is expected to pass that of the US during this century. A few more points to wrap it up. Population growth, as I've talked about, will be concentrated in Africa, and so that between 2017 and looking out till 2050, 26 African countries are expected to double, at least, in their population size. We have the 47 least developed countries that I mentioned before. They're projected to double from about 1 billion in 2013 to what reaches close to 2 billion in 2050. And these countries had births per woman in the order of 4.3. And so the projected total population is higher in this most recent UN report than before. Fertility estimates turned out to be higher in some countries, particularly in some sub-Saharan African countries. so that increases the estimates of births per woman. Actual fertility seems to have risen in some recent years for some countries. So in some cases it's estimates, but in a few countries actual increases. On the other hand, in some countries the previous estimates were too low, but that's how this balanced out. During 2010 to 2015, fertility was below the replacement level in 83 countries, and that was about 46% of world population. Of course, a large fraction of this is represented in China. And so I will stop episode 1 here, and we'll go on and examine population pyramids and its implications in the next episode.